All right, so we're still talking about Chapter 11, and this is video 2 on Chapter 11. We're going to continue talking about financial statement fraud and management's motivations for committing it. Typically, they want the stock price to stay high, right? They want that anyway, so if they have to cheat on the financial statements, they'll do that. Maximize their own bonuses. You know, these CEOs and CFOs get bonuses based on the stock price, and they get stock options, so they want to maximize their bonuses, increase their net worth. Sometimes they want to meet company expectations. On occasion, they're trying to do it for the company good. They're worried that the company could fail or something bad could happen if they don't do this, and they're not doing it for their own, lining their own pockets, other than maybe to keep their job, but they're trying to keep everybody employed, to keep the things from going under. So they see it as being good. However, when they do commit this, it does eventually come out. I mean, if you fake revenues or you move revenues from one quarter forward, then you won't have those revenues in the next. You have to keep doing it. Eventually, the accruals reverse, things like that, and you get caught. So then everything tumbles down, and it's worse than if you had just reported that loss in that quarter. So how do you detect financial statement fraud? Well, you use your reasoning, right? You think, where would they engage in fraud? So we already know, right? Well, they're going to recognize revenue that's not really appropriate to be recognized. They're going to make assets look larger than they are, right? Or they're going to make expenses look smaller than they are, right? These are all things that will improve the financial position of the organization, right? So I can predict ways they'll do it, and I can say, okay, if I was going to recognize revenue that was inappropriate, how would I do that? Well, I might move some of the revenue forward that I knew was coming in and claim it this year. That even though I know I'm going to get it next year, I'm going to claim it this year. I may capitalize some expenses. That's a great idea. That's what WorldCom did, right? So not only do it make my expenses look lower, it makes my assets look higher. Eventually, as you depreciate those assets, yes, they will become expenses. So it's not like you've done anything other than shift expenses out. But that's a way. So you can think about, how would they do it? What kind of company is this? How could they do it? Use your strategic reasoning. Ask, what types of fraud would they do? How could I find that? Well, if I think they're shifting revenue from a future quarter to this quarter, I could see, where are they saying their revenue is from? What sales are they saying they have? Track those sales. See if they're real sales, right? So I can think up some tests that can tell me things. I can do financial statement analysis, right? So I can say, well, this company has grown in this way in the past, and now all of a sudden it's doing it differently. That's suspicious. Let me look into that. I can say the rest of the industry has this gross margin, but my company has this other gross margin. Well, why is that? How can that be? Right, so I can do that. And non-financial performance measures, same way. If there's the financial performance measures, they're messing with the financial statements. But the non-financial ones, that's harder for them to cover up, right? So if they're saying they have revenue of this, say it's a hotel chain, say it's Hilton, and they say their revenue is these many millions of dollars, but their occupancy rate, right, how many people are using the rooms, is much lower than normal. How could their revenues go up when their occupancy rate went down, right? So you can compare these non-financial performance measures and tell if there's something going wrong. So there are ways to figure out if there's financial statement fraud or not. That's what auditors do all the time. They think about all of this stuff all the time when they go on audit. Now, how likely is a company, right? What's the risk that some financial statements you're looking at have some fraud in them? Well, there's some things you can look at that expose a company to fraud. So in other words, if these items are present, this company is more likely to have financial statement fraud going on. So we're going to look at some areas, right? And that will tell me how exposed to fraud they are and how risky, what the fraud risk is. And I'm going to look in 4 areas. I'm going to look at the managers and the directors of the company. I'm going to look at that company's relationships with others. I'm going to look at the organization itself and its industry and its position within the industry. And I'm going to look at the financial results and operating characteristics. So these can all tell me, is it likely there's fraud going on? So first set of characteristics are the managers and the board, right? So the managers, I'm not talking about like the store manager at Walmart. I'm talking about the CEO, the CFO, the chief operating officer, these high-level people who are really in charge of the decisions about the financial statements. I'm also talking about the board of directors, right? Because the board of directors is elected by the stockholders to watch over management. And if they're not watching management, they're not a very good board of directors, right? So looking at management's background, are they coming from some place where they've committed fraud in the past, or just had an unsuccessful company? What are they like? What are their motivations? Is their compensation based on what the financial statements say? So how much influence does management have in what's going on in the financial statements, right? Understanding their background, what kind of stock options, what kind of bonuses, understanding their influence, right? If you have a very strong CEO who everybody does what that person says, or does the board give guidance to the CEO who then implements it and people are constantly doing what's right for the company, right? So you can look at the management and the board and tell, okay, this organization seems like there could be fraud going on. It's got this CEO and he's the boss and he's telling everybody what to do. And the board isn't watching him, right? So these characteristics will tell you, okay, that there could be, doesn't say there is, but there would be more likely there would be fraud at a situation like that. Right, so there's other people besides the CEO and the CFO. So what kind of relationships should we look at with other organizations and other entities with respect to our company that would tell us there could be fraud here? All right. Well, the first set of relationships is with financial institutions and bondholders, right? So entities the company borrows from, right? So you need to understand, the more the company borrows, right, the more bonds they have outstanding, the more loans they have outstanding, right? The more likely they are to commit fraud. Why? Because one, they need to cover those debts, right? They have to earn the interest. They'll have higher expenses in interest, right? They'll have certain loan covenants that they have to meet, right? If you don't do this, you can't pay dividends. If you don't do this, we're going to repossess that collateral, right? So they have what they call loan covenants that they have to meet, right? And some of those covenants involve the financial statements, right? You have to have this much working capital. You have to have this much cash reserve. Right? So there's all these rules. When you take loans out, the lenders can make rules for you. Well, we're not going to lend you money unless you do this, right? So doing that may involve having to mess with the financial statements to make it look like they're doing, right? They can't do that. They don't have that amount of working capital, but we're going to look like we do, right? So you'd have to look at what the relationships are with financial institutions and see how much they've got borrowed and what the rules are. That'll tell you if they're risky or not. Relationship with related organizations. So organizations sometimes have what are called related party transactions, especially these family-owned businesses that are started out as a family and now they're a public company. So what happens is there'll be these transactions with the family members, and they're not what we call arm's length, right? So family members may be using the company to get themselves more money or to make the company look better, right? They may do a transaction that takes some liabilities off the books. but really then the company is guaranteeing. That's a lot of what happened with Enron very famously took a lot of liabilities off their books and put them in special purpose entities, and these special purpose entities belonged to related parties, belonged to the actual CFO owned a lot of these. So that's an easy way to perpetrate fraud. You set up these separate special purpose entities and they belong to this insider party. And you can look, these will typically show on the financial statements. All those special purpose entities and those transactions were all found in the footnotes of Enron. It's not like they didn't say they existed, right? But nobody took the time to say, well, this was a related party transaction. Who is this Chuco company, right? What is that? Who owns that? What's going on there, right? So you can look at those and tell, okay, if there's a lot of that going on, if there's these large transactions with related parties, doesn't mean there's fraud, but there could be. It's riskier. There's more of a fraud risk. The auditors. So a thing that happens when you're committing fraud and being audited, the auditors might catch you committing that fraud, right? So what can happen is the client being audited will get in crossways with the auditor, right? The auditor will come say, hey, this revenue you're recognizing for this quarter, that's not this quarter's revenue, that's next quarter's revenue. You have to take that off your financial statements, right? So now the auditor has caught them, and now they're going to be not wanting to make that change. The auditor said, you got to change. So frequently the auditor will be terminated. They'll fire the auditor, or they just won't pay the auditor and the auditor quits, right? And something happens. So when there's issues with the auditor, right, that's a red flag for fraud. Not always. It could be, sometimes people legitimately think they can get a better audit out of someone else. They're like, well, you know what? You guys don't really audit in this industry much, and your fees are too high, so I'm going to hire these other people who know this industry better, and their fees are lower because they're good at auditing this industry, right? So, there can be legitimate reasons to change auditors. But when there's a contentious relationship, when the auditors are saying, you need to change this, and they're saying, no, that's an issue, that's a risk. Attorneys. So corporations have attorneys working inside. They have their own lawyers that actually work for them, and they hire outside lawyers for all kinds of different reasons. This can be risky because lawyers are usually on the client's side, and they usually can't tell you what's going on with them. They have a lot more information than most people about a company that could be committing fraud. So lawyers usually won't tell you things because they can't. They have that attorney-client privilege. But you can tell sometimes things about, you see a lot of lawyer fees to outside lawyers. You see lawyers that specialize in certain things, setting up special purpose entities, things like that. Then you can start to wonder, like, they're using this lawyer that does a lot of this kind of work. That's interesting, right? So you can kind of look at that and tell, is there more or less likelihood of fraud? You're not going to get a lot out of lawyers, though, typically. Investors. So remember, different kinds of people invest in different companies. You can have investors who invest millions and millions of dollars. You have these high dollar investors who come in and take over companies, who come in and try to change companies around. Financial statement fraud is often starts because they want to get investors, right? They want to make the company look good so people will invest in them, right? So they do some what they call window dressing. Investors can go both ways. They're going to be looking at companies before they make investments, right? So now you've got this extra set of eyes on them. But also, you need to be aware that companies are making themselves look better to make investors happy, right? Get the earnings per share up, so the stock price will go up. If the stock price goes up, investors are happy, right? So you got to be careful of that relationship and even who the investors are, all right? And finally, you need to understand the company's relationship with regulators, right? So a company that's in fraud trouble will be having the SEC having enforcement actions, things like that. The PCAOB will be having comments about their audit, things like that. Do they file everything timely, right? If you're committing fraud, it's hard to file your financial statements on time because you're fixing them up. You're cooking the books. It takes a little longer. There's some companies are what they call regulated industries, where there's additional government agencies watching over them. Banks come to mind. A bank is a very heavily regulated industry, so you can check with them and see if there's problematic issues. If somebody's having a problem paying their taxes, that's a real big problem. They're probably committing fraud somewhere to try to pay those taxes, because that's the last thing you want. Because if you don't pay your taxes, they can come and take all your property. So taxes, I don't know if it's down to they're having tax liens on them. Avoid that investing in that company for sure. All right, so we're going to stop there with these relationships, and we're going to pick up with the last two parts of the fraud exposure triangle, and we're going to talk about exposure related to the organization and its industry and its financial results.